Good afternoon. My name is Kieba Hulela. I'm the current president for the African Student Association, and this talk was organized by the association in conjunction with the lectures office and also funded by the GSB office. We welcome you all and thank you for attending this lecture. The purpose of this lecture really is one of the things that we as the African Student Association last year decided that we should introduce lectures of this kind in order to address issues of Africa and also to educate the community about the African situations. So this afternoon, we are going to listen to a speaker. First, I will introduce the speaker. Our speaker today is Andrew Mujuni Mwenda, currently a Knight Fellow at Stanford University in California. Andrew Mujuni Mwenda was born in Uganda, East Africa, earned his bachelor's degree in mass communication from Makerere University in Kampala, Uganda. He also studied at the University of London School and London School of Oriental and African Studies. Since 2004, he has been political editor for the Daily Monitor newspaper, Ugandan's leading independent daily. In addition to supervision of staff or reporters, Mwenda writes more columns a week. He also hosts a time current affairs radio talk shows every weekday evening. He began his journalism career at Monitor Publications Limited, first as a reporter, then assistant editor for investigations. From 2002 to 2024, Mwenda was general manager of KFM Radio. His involvement in journalism made him develop interest in development issues of Africa, particularly the issue of foreign aid. This afternoon, Andrew Mujuni Mwenda will talk about Africa and the case of foreign aid. Please join me and the African Student Association, together with the ISU Office of Lectures, to welcome Andrew Mujuni Mwenda to the stage to address us.
Good afternoon. I want to begin by thanking the Africa Students Association of Iowa State University for inviting me to this place. I would never on earth have ever dreamt of coming to Iowa. I have been to America more than possibly 10, 15 times. I have been to so many places. But I never ever thought I would ever visit Iowa, because whenever you are coming from the third world to America, you normally go to New York or Washington, D.C. or LA, San Francisco, Las Vegas, and Miami. It's so difficult to find a reason to come to Iowa. So I am very happy that I have been invited to the State University of Iowa to speak about something I hold very dear, and that is international assistance, what is normally called foreign aid to Africa. But let me begin with the three things. One, I am a radio talk show host from Africa, and when I'm speaking, I'm very politically incorrect. Please, when I indulge in my cultural practice, bear with me. The second, when I went to school to study journalism, My lecturers told me that my voice was not very good for radio and that my face was not good for television. Therefore, I perfected my skills of communication through writing. So when I'm speaking, I may speak very fast in a foreign accent. Please, I kindly request you to be rude enough to warn me to slow down when I speak very fast. Let me also say that when I say I am critical of foreign aid to Africa, I do not want you to understand me in a narrow sense of foreign aid in the form of financial aid and technical assistance. In fact, I'm even critical of international humanitarian assistance, whether it is in the form of relief medicines, food to the hungry, or peacekeeping troops. So, in my presentation today, I will tackle all those areas. In 2005, I was invited by the government of the United Kingdom for a meeting with the Prime Minister of Britain, Tony Blair. Mr. Tony Blair had formed something called the Commission for Africa. I do not know whether any one of you have heard of it. And the Commission for Africa was supposed to organize the developed world to raise money for Africa. And they achieved two things, or three things I must say. One was to have the G8 summit. I don't know whether when I use these expressions, they are expressions that all of you here know. Does anyone here know the G8 summit? The G8 refers to the group of 8 most industrialized countries, including the United States, Japan, Germany, the United Kingdom, France, Italy, Canada, and Russia. Have I finished all of them? I hope so. The G8 agreed, one, to double aid to Africa by 2010, to cancel all Africa's debts, and also to remove agricultural subsidies which Western governments give to their farmers so that African farmers can be able to export themselves out of poverty. My meeting, I had been very critical in Uganda of Blair's efforts, and my meeting, if I had been criticizing an African president, of course I would have been either jailed or shot. But since I was criticizing a Western leader, I think it is the cultural practice of the West to engage opponents, and I was invited for that meeting with Mr. Tony Blair to dissuade me. After my meeting with him, I got even more frustrated. Why? Because I think that it is Western assistance to Africa that lies at the heart of that continent's inability to reform itself. It is Western assistance to Africa that sustains incompetent and very corrupt and brutal governments in power. It is Western assistance to Africa that stifles the evolution of institutions that can mediate a relationship between the state and the citizen on that continent. How? This is an academic institution. I will therefore veer between academic and academic work and journalism. The classical state, if you read the works of people like Charles Tilly in Europe, emerged out of the contingencies of war. European monarchs were impelled by the desire to secure security at home. They had to fight wars abroad. Now, wars could always pay for themselves from loot and booty, but the problem increasingly for European monarchs became that wars could be long and costly, and therefore to sustain armies at war or at the battlefront required a steady source of revenue. As a consequence of that, European monarchs developed a vested interest in harnessing the private economy. They either needed to tax their own citizens in order to generate revenue or to borrow from them. Regardless of whatever method they selected, it was important that the monarchs negotiate with those who owned assets in order to generate revenue to fight wars. But to negotiate with somebody for their resources also requires that you listen to them. You evolve institutions through which this negotiation can take place. And therefore, within European history, we see the emergence of parliaments as institutions through which states negotiated with citizens for revenue. So states developed a vested interest in harnessing the private economy in order to be able to ensure their own security. That was the classical state. Because of that process, there was the evolution of what you would call a state that provides economic welfare. It promotes economic growth and development and therefore social welfare. The idea, therefore, that human beings should live in an economically prosperous and politically free environment evolved from the Western world and has spread to the rest of the world. I can tell you there is no part of Africa where you go and you do not find that people's perception of government is that it should create an enabling environment for them to farm, to trade, and to prosper. But also, in doing that, to ensure that there is proper healthcare and education. The debate, there can be disagreement whether that should be provided by the state or by the people themselves. But there is one clear agreement that the government should provide an enabling environment through which citizens can raise their own revenue and pay for their, in order to meet their basic social needs, especially healthcare and education, or it can provide such benefits itself if it can't create that environment for them to be provided to the general public through the private sector. So the legitimacy of any government today in the world really depends on its ability to generate economic resources. The political survival of any government in Africa depends on its ability to raise revenue. Even at a very narrow level, revenue is very important for governments precisely because revenue provides the resources through which governments in Africa can train and equip their armies and police in order to use them to ensure not only basic law and order, but also to repress and suppress those of their opponents who want to challenge them. Governments also use economic resources, and I'm now focusing on Africa, because they need to buy those who support them. They need to reward constituencies that support them. Elite constituencies are rewarded with jobs in the government from which, either officially or through illicit activity, corruption and bribery, they can generate revenue to lead the kind of lifestyles they want to lead. Governments also need to win certain constituencies by building boreholes and roads and schools. All these require revenue. I want to argue today that if that revenue were to be generated from within the domestic economy, over time governments would learn the importance of harnessing the talents of their citizens to generate economic resources that can finance their political survival. The problem for Africa today is that the productive margin in the government's search for revenue does not lie in the domestic economy. It lies with international donors. Rather than engage us as citizens in the process of negotiation of what policies and institutions are necessary to increase our productivity, the governments in Africa find it much more productive to discuss with the IMF and the World Bank what is necessary for us. Basically, therefore, the existence of the international aid industry undermines the evolution of a democratic culture where governments negotiate with the citizens. We have been rendered irrelevant in our own countries precisely because he who pays the piper often calls the tune. And I want to pose an important challenge. Why should any government get aid? I arrived in this country in August last year. I live in an upscale neighborhood in a town called Palo Alto, near Stanford University. And because it is a rich neighborhood, which means whoever lives there really has to pay hefty sums of money for rent, credit organizations have been writing to me on my address, throwing credit cards on me, like it's running out of fashion. Washington Mutual, Citibank, Chase Manhattan. I can't count. I think I have, if I accepted all the requests, I would right now be having not less than 15 credit cards. So, if governments want to borrow money, I believe they do not need the existence of IMF or World Bank. They are international lenders in the international financial market to give them money. The problem, of course, is that if you go to borrow from private lenders, You must demonstrate, one, the ability to pay, because banks loan against, not against security, never. You can have 20 houses and no bank will give you money. You must demonstrate that from the loan, you can generate a stream of income or from other activities to repay the loan. So the bank is an investor in an economic project that you are undertaking. Banks lend against expected income. If governments in Africa were required to actually borrow from the market, then they would have to go to Chase Manhattan, to Citibank, to Wells Fargo, to whichever credit organization, with proper economically productive activities. I want to say today that governments in Africa do not borrow to finance development, although that is often the claim. They often borrow to consume. I come from a country called Uganda that may present the best illustration of this argument. Uganda has been hailed by the international aid organizations, both bilateral institutions, like the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, the Department for International Development, DFID of the British government, NORAD of Sweden, SIDA and SIDA, SIDA as C and SIDA as S of Canada and Sweden, GTZ of Germany, name them. All these organizations include, plus the IMF, the World Bank and the UNDP have hailed Uganda as Africa's economic success story. But I also want to add that that country depends on foreign aid for 50% of its budget. Aid is important for Uganda because, on the face of it, it finances free primary education. It also finances basic health care for the citizens, but it also finances the government's projects to construct roads and renovate hospitals and schools. Does Uganda really need aid? Let me present for you the picture. The government of Uganda has a cabinet, the president of Uganda has a cabinet of 70 ministers. There is a minister for everything in Uganda, even one possibly for chairs. The president of Uganda also has 114 presidential advisors. They never see him except on television. And when they get an opportunity to see him physically, it is at public functions, and even there, it is him who advises them. In the last year before I left Uganda, the government of Uganda read a budget. And in that budget, the government had raised 2.6 trillion shillings as its revenue. The government of Uganda had budgeted to spend 2.5 trillion shillings. Out of 2.6, 2.5 trillion was budgeted as recurrent expenditure, let's say government consumption. I can see some of you here are old enough to be having homes. If you earn a salary of $10,000 every month and you devote all of it to gambling in the casino, drinking in the bar, and buying food, you clearly know that you're not building a future for yourself or your children. So from your income of $10,000 a month, some of it you pay for your mortgage, that is a saving. Some of it, possibly you put it into a financial portfolio, it may be a mutual fund, a pension fund, or you may buy stock in a company. But that way, you are choosing part of your income to be an investment from which you will enjoy returns in the future. Then the rest of the money, you devote it to your recurrent needs, which is possibly buying gas for your car and buying clothes and feeding yourself. But also you also invest some of the money in the future of your children by giving them a good education. The question is, why does the government of Uganda devote 99% of its revenue to recurrent expenses? I want to say that it is because somebody else is willing to pick its other bills. In other words, by the international aid community offering Uganda international aid, they are encouraging it to sustain a structure of expenditure that favors consumption over investment. They are helping the government of Uganda sustain an obese cabinet of 70 ministers, 114 presidential advisors, and now 81 units of local government, what here in America you call states. Each state in 2004, we had only 56. Our president amended the constitution to remove term limits. For him to achieve that, he needed to give every local community an independent state. And now, we have 81 states. I want to use the word states rather than districts because here a unit of local government is called a state. So you have 81 Iowas, which have increased from 56 in just 2 years because the president wanted to be re-elected. In other words, well, let me frame my argument like this, that these actions by governments in Africa, their propensity to overconsume, their propensity to disregard the concerns of their citizens, may be politically beneficial and rational in the short term, but in the medium to long term, it is economically destructive. Governments in Africa are shielded from paying the political price of their economic irrationality by the subsidy that comes in the form of foreign aid. In other words, foreign aid is the subsidy that allows governments in Africa to sustain profligate spending, luxurious lifestyles by presidents. Every African president has a private jet. Every African president wants to live in a palace. Every African president wants to spend $50 million on himself, even when their citizens are studying under mango trees and others are going without basic health care. In other words, whenever you see hungry and diseased Africans, it is not because our countries do not have sufficient revenue or cannot design the right institutional and policy incentives to ensure increased agricultural productivity. It is precisely because our countries are mismanaged. The second point, I want to move now from financial assistance to go to a more controversial one, which is relief assistance. Or after financial assistance, let me talk about technical assistance. Governments in Africa do not recruit people into government and other government positions out of merit. They do so out of tribal, family, and political connection. The president's wife becomes the head of the central bank. The minister's cousin becomes head of the investment authority, even if she cannot explain what the words capital markets means. What the words capital markets mean. The army commander's brother becomes the head of the stock exchange, and the chief of security's sister becomes head or advisor on international trade, even when they do not know what the words WTO stand for. Now, in other words, states in Africa are not centers of professional excellence, they are theaters of patrimonial privilege. Such states, such institutions cannot be relied upon to do anything creative, whether it is in the design of policies or in the placement or the evolution of institutional incentives that favor growth. These practices, again, they tend to generate economic failure, and economic failure tends to generate political threats. Political threats are that a government in fiscal decline, a government whose revenues are going down, of course, confronts many challenges. Its opponents may mobilize a discontented population against the regime. Alternatively, if the regime is very brutal, its opponents can stage a military coup. Unpaid armies in Africa tend to mutiny. It has happened in Congo. Many times the US government financed the French troops, the Belgian troops, and Moroccan troops to come and reinstate Mobutu after his own citizens had removed him. In Sierra Leone, in Liberia, in Somalia, all the countries that received a lot of aid, the moment the aid dried out and they were therefore unable to pay their armies, they either faced internal military mutiny or other political and military entrepreneurs organized rebellions and overthrew them. So bottom line is that any government will need revenue. Now, equally, the governments of Africa have been so hostile to their own skilled citizens that many of them, if you are an African and you are worth your brain, you migrate to the Western world. There is an exit option for you. This exit option is a product of the lack of incentives for skilled people to remain on that continent. Many people think that the Western world is against migration. I disagree with that proposition because I think that the Western world is against migration of underskilled or unskilled labor. Nobody worth their human skills is excluded from Western labor markets. You go to Microsoft, IBM, you go to Stanford, and possibly here Iowa, many Africans who are intelligent always have opportunities, and the visa is always easy to come by. So, once the African governments have chased away their own citizens who are skilled, then they go to the Western world asking for technical assistance. And therefore, technical assistance is another subsidy that allows governments in Africa to sustain policies that chase away their own intelligent and skilled citizens. Food relief. It is not true that droughts cause famine, because droughts are acts of nature characterized by insufficient rainfall, leading to crop failure. A famine is a social phenomenon characterized by shortage of food, leading to hunger and starvation. The transition from the act of nature called a drought to a social problem called famine is mediated by public policies and political institutions that mediate the relationship or that manage the relationship between food production and rain failure, between rainfall and food production. How? Through irrigation, through the use of drought-resistant seed varieties, through importation of food, countries can ensure that there is provision of food without ever there being a famine in spite of drought. Again, whenever hunger hits Africa and it is shown on Western television screens, the immediate reaction of the kind of people of this world is to send food to the continent, and in the process help these governments sustain bad policies that undermine food security and therefore make these countries dependent on food. The other reality, of course, the other problem of international assistance is in form of peacekeeping troops. I personally believe that a lot of times many of Africa's civil wars are a reflection of internal efforts at institutional change. Civil wars represent a failure of existing political arrangements and therefore a challenge to them. I'll give you an example of Rwanda. In 1994, there was a genocide in Rwanda. The genocide took place, many people say, because the international community failed to act. That is wrong. President Clinton himself has said the one act he regrets most was that he was unable to act to stop the genocide in Rwanda. I have always asked myself, why does Clinton think that it was him to save the people of Rwanda from genocide? Couldn't the people of Rwanda save themselves? Did they need the fifth Calvary of the international community to save them? I want to inform you today that in fact, the genocide in Rwanda happened in spite of, but also because of international interference. The international community had deployed in Rwanda an international peacekeeping force. It was called UNAMIR, United States Assistance Mission to Rwanda. It was drawn from 21 countries and was commanded by a Canadian general called Romeo Dallaire. Under the existing rules of international intervention, the intervening force must be neutral. In Rwanda's case, it meant the intervening force, the UN force, had to sit between the Hutu extremist government committed to genocide and the Tutsi-led rebels who were fighting that government. That was one. The second was not only to stand between them, it was to make them sign a ceasefire. They signed one such a ceasefire which fell apart. The third was to ensure a government of national unity. Now, sometime last year, I watched a documentary here in this country on PBS called Ghosts of Rwanda. The people who did this documentary on PBS make a strong case why, complaining that the international community did not intervene, that is why the genocide happened in Rwanda. And yet in this documentary, they show the presence of UN troops. In other words, the international community intervened but failed to stop the genocide. The documentary makes a strong case why the US should have sent in troops. When the genocide started in Rwanda, the people of Rwanda, on their own, were able to fight and remove the government that was orchestrating the genocide, and they succeeded within 100 days. The documentary does not recognize that there was a force within Rwanda with the military capability to end the genocide. The Western mind frame was that white people should go and save Africans. The inability to see that there was agency within this country that had the capability to end the genocide was lost. Because if it was appreciated that in the context of Rwanda there were the forces of good opposing genocide and the government committed to genocide, the international community's intervention should have been to provide resources to the RPF, the rebels who were fighting, so that instead of winning the war in 100 days, they could have won the war in 10 days and therefore stopped the genocide early. But the people at the United Nations were concerned with raising troops from France, from the United Kingdom, from Belgium, from every other place in the world except from within Rwanda. So again, I want to say that Western intervention in Africa is predicated, I think, on an incipient or implicit assumption that Africans cannot master their own destiny, Africans cannot be agents of their own self-advancement, and that Africans do not have the capacity to manage their own affairs. Having said all that, I want to end here. I think I have used about 30 minutes so that we can have a more interactive discussion. I'm willing to listen to your comments and your criticisms. Thank you very much. Yes, sir.
There's a debate going on in the U.S. and it's taking the debate that I know of is taking place in the form of books about this issue, and the more perceptive people, I think, are saying what they're saying. So I agree with what you just said. Now, that does raise the question, though. I can think of two situations. Well, one situation where there's an attempt by Americans to do something in Africa, because I think there are people who want to do something who know the white man's burden is false, but they see the situation, they know the statistics, and they want to intervene. They want to do something. Now, one example of a Christian who's done this is a minister from Southern California named Rick Warren. He wrote the Times bestseller, The Purpose-Driven Life. He has a church that's seeking to do things with Rwanda, and I think what they're doing is going village to village or city to city, finding leaders and cooperating with them. In other words, asking them, what can we do? And I'm just wondering, in light of what you said, because what your criticism was American governmental aid. So I'm wondering if this kind of thing has some value. And the second one, there was a fellow who was doing philanthropy before Gates. He took his millions and millions of dollars that he made with Microsoft, and he went into philanthropy before Gates. And what he did was this principle called the central liberal truth, which is that you need to change it. Well, let's put it this way. They think that in long-term development, the best thing you can do in any society and country is teach women to read. Because in most societies, women teach the children, so that at that point he's going village to village, city to city, and in Sri Lanka, and he's starting K-12 schools. He's taking his millions of Microsoft money, and that's how he's spending his time starting K-12 schools, because he believes in the research that shows you can go after AIDS, you can go after malaria, you can do health stuff, you can do micro-literacy, but the most strategic thing long-term is education. And I'm just wondering what you think of these two interventions. It's not foreign aid, it's not government level, it's private. Is there value in this, even though there's Americans trying to help Africans? Is there value in doing it on that level?
Well, let me put it this way. My greatest criticism is aid that goes to government. People-to-people aid, I may have some criticisms of it, but I find it tolerable. My presentation today was regarding aid from governments and international financial institutions to fellow governments, because they create the wrong incentives for governments. In fact, I should have said that, you see, aid is a presentation of failure. Governments that are well managed tend to grow their economies and therefore do not need aid. I'll give you an example of Botswana. The people who took over the leadership of Botswana after independence in 1966 managed the economy very well and created fiscal independence. In other words, they borrowed repaid their loans, and went home. The international community departed. But if you look at countries like Ghana, Nigeria, Uganda, Zambia, Kenya, these were developing economies that could borrow on the market. Then you had an Idi Amin, you had Daniel Arap Moi of Kenya, you had the different military dictators of Nigeria and Ghana. They plundered their countries. Having plundered them, having demonstrated that these men are not only incompetent, they are also corrupt, they are brutal and economically destructive. Then the good World Bank came and said, okay, since you have destroyed your economy and you have destroyed even your credibility to borrow from the market, then we will subsidize you with cheap loans from the World Bank and from other bilateral institutions. In other words, aid exists precisely because countries are mismanaged. Aid goes to those governments that mismanage their economies. Governments that deserve aid do not get it because they don't need it. The countries that need aid do not deserve it because aid encourages them to continue practicing their bad economic and political practices. Now, that is why government-to-government aid is very bad, because people in the Western world are taxed, and a tax is an involuntary transfer of resources from citizens to the government. For the government of the US to collect taxes from its own citizens and throw them at Marshal Mobutu Sese Seko, Idi Amin, Robert Mugabe, Yoweri Museveni, and all these other African dictators teeming all over the continent is absurd, because you are penalizing, you are using the resources of American citizens to give brutal governments resources to buy arms and train armies in order to kill their own citizens. Every day I go to jail, I come out complaining that somehow either the British or the Americans have paid for my sufferings. Anyhow, the bottom line is that if it is people-to-people help, it is understandable precisely because individuals can easily change and therefore withdraw the aid. The second is about education. I know that education is so important. It is so important because I wouldn't be here if I wasn't educated, and I wouldn't have been here if my dad possibly wasn't educated. But this is what I want to say, that I personally think that the best intervention in Africa is not one that spreads charity. That continent is collapsing under the weight of Western charity. Children do not have fees, we will pay for them. Farmers do not have this, we will give them medicine. This village does not have a road, we will construct it for them. In other words, a typical average African has been stripped of all initiative precisely because they're being spoon-fed. It is dangerous to cultivate a culture of dependence on anybody. Education is important. I can tell you, it is not true that poor people do not save and do not invest. That is hearsay. Poor people, even the poorest of people, can save, build capital, they can save, invest, and accumulate capital. Possibly this is not the right forum for me to explain such a complex process, but there are many people here possibly who have studied peasant societies, and you can see patterns of whether it is supporting migration, selling a piece of land or one's chicken and goats to finance the education of their children. If education has a high return, I can promise you poor people will save and sacrifice and invest in it. Because in investing in their children's education, they're investing in their own future. When the children grow up, go to good schools, they come back home, they build better homes for their parents, and they provide their parents better economic resources than the circumstances under which they lived. And that practice, anyone here who has come from Africa is aware of it. So poor people can pay for the education. The most important thing is to make education affordable. Once you make education affordable, in which case the state can subsidize it only for those who genuinely cannot afford. Those who can afford should pay for the education. It is important to make people have a vested interest in their own future and the future of their children. Whenever a person pays and makes a contribution to something, the following things develop. They have a vested interest in that education. So they will not only value the education, but they will also be able to supervise, is this education of good quality? I'll give you an example. At the time I went to Uganda, to school in Uganda, primary school, that is in the 1980s, you could pay your fees. And there were, because the state in Uganda had started collapsing, parents formed what they were called PTAs, parent-teacher associations. And these associations raised building fund, and they built schools. The parents inspected teachers' work to see whether we were getting the quality education. In the 1990s, the international aid industry brought something called free education. The moment parents started sending their children to schools where they were not investing money, they lost interest in their children's education. And a study in Uganda found that 65% of students who go to these free government schools, 65% of those can neither read nor write. They go to school, they don't get an education, because the parents' incentive has been destroyed. One of the most dramatic examples in Uganda are two schools. One is thatched with grass, another one is built in modern style by the government. There are more students in the poor private school, which is thatched with ordinary grass, than the government school. You know why? In the government school, teachers don't turn up. In the private school, because teachers pay, they supervise and they look at the curriculum and they're interested to know how because they're making an investment, they have a vested interest. They have a stake in that education. So it's important to have people always have a stake, rather than have people depend on alms from government. So I believe in education, but education should only be made affordable for those who cannot afford. Those who can afford should be able to pay for their children. Of course, many people in Africa do not invest in the education of their children, because it's not through education that you get an opportunity. If a person is recruited into government on the basis of their clan, their tribe, or their political affiliation, rather than on the basis of their professional competence and probity, then, in other words, if career advancement is predicated upon lobbying the government for favors rather than performing, of course, very few people will have a vested interest in investing in education. Do I answer your question?
Yes.
Yes, sir. Yeah, just one second. Okay.
I've been asked to ask the people who are making questions or making comments to say their names and their, let me see, designations. So thank you.
My name is Francis Owusu. I teach at University. I think anytime that you start talking about Africa, you run into the problem of the diversity within the continent. And I think that's the tension that you have to deal with. I do agree with your diagnosis of the problems in Africa. You address three issues. One is foreign aid, one is technical assistance, and one is humanitarian assistance. And the way you have diagnosed the causes of the problems, I do agree with you. Let me just take one as an example and actually ask you to think a little bit about your recommendations. We all know that you talked about the fact that because African governments do not have to go to the market to borrow money, they are not accountable to their people. Now, my first impression is that probably you are giving African people less credit than they do deserve. For instance, the Lawrence government of Ghana was supported extensively with funding from the IMF and the World Bank. But when the people saw the inefficiency even with that funding, his party was voted out of power. Okay? So that is one thing, that even though you can get a lot of money from the World Bank, you are still accountable to the people. And the people know when you misuse that money. That's the first point. The other point is that, we have examples in history where states have gone to the private sector to borrow money. And the type of checks and balances that you talked about never happened. Talk about the petrodollars in the 1970s and the 1980s. The Mobutus and others were able to get all this money from the private lender because it was guaranteed by the state. Now, the state cannot declare bankruptcy. The state would always have to pay. So you can declare bankruptcy. So when Citibank is giving you credit card, you have to make sure that you are using the money effectively. Citibank doesn't have to do that because they have the support of the U.S. government, the World Bank, and the IMF. So if Ghana government took a loan from the Citibank and the Ghana government doesn't pay, the U.S. government, World Bank, and IMF will insist that Ghana pays that. So that protects the lender from not bearing the full cost of their investment in developing countries. That is the second point. I was going to talk about the third point, but let me just leave it to you so that you can respond. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Owusu.
Yes.
First of all, I want to agree with you that Africa is diverse, but the statement I'm making is not even about Africa, even the US here. I do not think that it is possible. If the government of the US depended on the people of Uganda to give it money for it to manage its affairs here, the incentive for it to engage its own citizens would be reduced. So although Africa is a large and diverse continent, the statement I'm making is really about human nature. I personally think that nations develop out of self-interested actions of governments and individuals when they're negotiating for revenue. The survival of the government determines the survival of the elite coalition that rules a given territory, and the resources it is able to command determines its relationship with its citizens. You look at oil-producing countries. You see, governments can raise money through tax revenue. Alternatively, they can raise money through borrowing from their own citizens or borrowing from abroad. The other alternative, of course, is that they can sit on a hole in the earth, get out a rich mineral like oil or diamonds, sell it abroad at a very high profit, and be able to equip their armies and pay for their patronage without having to negotiate for citizens. Now that's the resource curse. That is why oil-rich countries, with the exception of Botswana and Norway, it is difficult to find a country that is rich in natural resources like oil and diamonds that is democratic. Why? Because the governments of such nations do not have to negotiate, do not need to negotiate with citizens, with their own people for revenue. They get it from a hole in the earth. So, to that extent, and to that extent alone, I think that Africa and the rest of the world share those common similarities. I'll give you an example of an exception in Africa, Rwanda. The government of Rwanda depends on foreign aid for 60% of its budget, yet it is a very responsible government. Post-genocide Rwanda is the most effective, clean, and how can I say, it's very effective, very clean in terms of its attempt to bring about economic change and administrative change. Why? In spite of the fact that it depends on foreign aid for large sums of money. It is because the Tutsi led RPF, the party, the rebel group that captured power in Rwanda was led by the Tutsi. The Tutsi are about 15% of the population of Rwanda. In the attempt to capture power, they confronted a genocide. And many of them were wiped out, about 800,000 of them. Now, for them to hold power as a minority, they need three things. One, they must ensure a strong military and security apparatus as a defense against another genocide from the majority Hutu, who are 85% of the population. So they face a strong group threat, and that group threat imposes upon them a strong revenue imperative. They need revenue, one, to have a strong army and security service to ensure that they're able to hold power. But two, as we all know, force has never been sufficient in holding any regime in power. There are very few governments in this world that have sought to rely on force purely for their survival. So governments have to win legitimacy. In Rwanda's case, if it is a Hutu president, because he can identify with the rest of the population, it would be easy for them to rule because their legitimacy comes from the fact that they are part of what they used to call a sociological majority. But in Rwanda's case, the Tutsi need to win every iota of legitimacy to rule in Rwanda. And as a consequence, they build good roads. They ensure that public institutions are well taken care of. Education and health services that are provided are of good quality in order to ensure legitimacy. So, to that extent, there is a unique case, which is Rwanda, because of the peculiar nature of the threats that the ruling elites face in Rwanda. Now, about change in Ghana, you see, in Ghana, in Africa, we have seen so many changes of government, in other words, of rulers, without seeing a change in the quality of government. So, I am not very enthusiastic about Ghana up to now, that there may have been a change of leadership from one ruling elite coalition to another ruling elite coalition, but if aid remains prevalent in Ghana, it will be very difficult to reconstruct, to evolve a state that is fiscally prudent and that engages a lot in dialogue with its own people. One of those dialogues, of course, is with the private sector. It's so important for Africa to generate private enterprises that can employ people. The problem of Africa is not so much the challenge is not one of poverty reduction, really. It is of wealth creation. How do you create wealth? The intervention cannot be charity. paying for people's education and health. The most important thing is to put in place the right institutional and policy incentives for people to earn better incomes, or to trade or get jobs and earn better incomes and pay for their own education. That is the biggest challenge. I should give you statistics, by the way. In Uganda, 88% of the population is self-employed. In America, 93% of the population is employed by somebody else. Only 7% in America are self-employed. Now you know why the US has a per capita income of $40,000 and Uganda a per capita income of $2,000. It's because Ugandans work for themselves. In America, people work for small, medium, or large-scale enterprises. They're employed by somebody else. And therefore, the agencies of wealth creation are entrepreneurs. And entrepreneurs are always a very small segment of the population. Joseph Schumpeter, whom I admire immensely, argued that they are actually 4% of the population. 20% are imitators. Then the rest of us are people who work for somebody else, because really we are followers. Yes, sir.
I would like to ask about, named George Barron. I've worked many years with World Health Organization principally in Asia and South America. But I would like to ask about the United Nations agencies in the areas in which you have been discussing. First of all, when United Nations works in AIDS prevention and control, in Uganda is held up as being one of the great successes in Africa, and two aspects are cited. One is that Uganda is part of the United Nations, therefore it's not foreign aid per se. When money comes through United Nations to do this. Secondly, the World Health Organization personnel are on the field, not in the capital city in an air-conditioned quarters, but they're on the field working side by side with the people of the country. Now, has it been as successful as we read of?
Well, I think that yes, Uganda's aid story has been quite successful. I am not so sure whether I am a fan of UN agencies, because my own experience with the UN agencies is that the resources, I'll give you an example right now. The UN is involved in Congo. It has a peacekeeping force there. They spend $600 million per year on that peacekeeping force. I can tell you that peacekeeping force does not ensure security even in one village. Any competent government in Africa, given $600 million, would ensure security of a territory twice the size of Congo. Second, if it's not a thieving government like the one of Uganda, if you have a more effective state like the one in Rwanda. The second, I have been to Liberia. There are so many UN agencies. The UN runs this and that. They spend about $700 million. And you ask yourself, where does it go? The UN pays its employees $15,000 a month. Young, incompetent, inexperienced staff who, if you were to encourage Liberians with skills to work in their own country and even pay them 1/5 of that price, pay them $2,500, they would do a much superior job. In other words, the UN is crowding out skilled Liberians, and therefore spending so much money to achieve very little. The UN has a tribunal in Arusha, the Rwanda Tribunal, trying the genocide suspects in Rwanda. For the last 5 years, they have spent $600 million and they have convicted only 15 people. They have concluded only 15 cases. What is that? In Rwanda, they can try 10,000 people and spend $1 million or less. The UN spends $700 million on 15. The aid industry, I should tell you, itself is caught up in a game of self-perpetuation. The aid industry survives precisely because they are bad governments. Bad governments are the raw material on which the aid industry survives, and the aid industry, in my view, only pays the hefty salaries and luxurious lifestyles of its employees rather than really improve the welfare of the people. Now, we come to AIDS in Uganda. Again, self-interest and political vulnerability. The thesis of my discussion today is that it is political vulnerability that creates the right incentives for the evolution of good and effective government, of good and effective states. Why? On the 31st of December 1999, I was a private guest to President Yoweri Museveni, and we sat over a cup of coffee and started talking about the army in Uganda. And the president told me that when he took over power in 1986, when he came into government, he started sending young officers of the Ugandan army to Cuba for training. He said by 1987, 40% of the officers he sent abroad for training would be returned to Uganda by the Cuban authorities, and the Cuban authorities said they were HIV positive and therefore unfit to undergo the rigorous military training required of them. So the action of returning them had been going on from 86 through 87. So in 1988, President Fidel Castro of Cuba called Museveni, the president of Uganda, and said, Yoweri, that is our president's first name. Yoweri is the Ugandan version of Joel. He said, Joel, you are facing a strong rebellion in the northern region of your country. But your army is going to be defeated, not by the bullets of the enemy, but by the AIDS pandemic. Your entire officer corps is falling apart. Now, Museveni told me that he had been thinking about this problem because the head of his own escort unit was sick with AIDS. His own brother, who was the commander of the army, was HIV positive. And many officers close to him were sick. So, and this is what Museveni said. He said, what Castro told me crystallized my thoughts because I had been thinking about this problem. Now look at this. Castro never addressed himself to the humanitarian crisis that Museveni was facing. That you have AIDS in your country, no. He addressed himself to Museveni's political vulnerability. At that time, Museveni had come to power using the army. So the core of his rule was really the military. His political party was still weak with a shaky and narrow political base. And therefore, he had called other political parties into a coalition government to be able to rule. But the backbone of his rule was really the military. But this backbone was being depleted by the AIDS pandemic. So, Castro never told him, Mr. President, your nation is facing a humanitarian disaster. He told him, your regime is facing a threat of collapse. And Museveni immediately learned that the only way he could save his regime was to fight AIDS. The problem was that the soldiers were getting AIDS from the surrounding society. To fight AIDS in the army, it was important to fight AIDS in the society. Now, in many African cultures, talking openly about sex is taboo. People don't talk about it. But to fight AIDS required openness and to be able to talk about sex. So, the cabinet in Uganda decided that we are going to create a public awareness campaign about this problem. In the school, in the home, and in the church. Every government official giving a speech was required to end the speech with a warning about AIDS. And they even encouraged government officials to attend funerals. I remember a funeral I attended of my aunt in 1988. She had died of AIDS, but people were afraid and they said she has died of malaria. A government official who was attending stood up and said, no, listen people, we have a crisis in the country. It is destroying us. It is transmitted through, this is the disease, it's called AIDS. It's transmitted through sex. You need to abstain from sex. If you cannot afford to abstain, please stick to one partner. Be faithful to them. If you cannot be faithful, please use a condom. That's the message. Abstain is A, be faithful is B, or use a condom is C. A, B, C. That is how the message evolved in Uganda. All of a sudden in Uganda, in the home, in the church, and in the school, we were being told about sex. For the first time, my mother talked to me about sex. I'm sure the white people here cannot understand how hard it was for African parents to change and sit with their children and talk to them about sex. It was such a big taboo. So culture had to change if the regime had to be saved. In other words, the other African governments did not respond to the AIDS pandemic precisely because they never faced political threats from it. The government of Museveni faced a political threat and therefore was able to fight and successfully control the AIDS pandemic. The people who came from other countries to visit Uganda were overwhelmed by the openness with which Ugandans in the church, in the school, and in the homestead talked about AIDS. So, my own view, therefore, is that political vulnerability is very, very important for cultural change, for institutional change, even for the design of the right policies that bring about improved welfare of the citizen. Yes, sir.
Sorry, I cannot stand up here.
It's no problem.
Okay. You talk about the age in Africa, we talk about a lot of issues. You have to understand too the Monetary Fund International, they have a success story in Africa. All the story was like a negative. It was a success story in Botswana,